Now we have a mic. Okay. Yeah, it's very different. What I think is fascinating about galleries is their staging of an intersection between artistic and commercial values. On one hand, they are commercial establishments, stores, not different in kind from any store selling things. On the other hand, the art they sell has aesthetic, ethical, political, social value, and very often is about personal, gender, racial identity. Hence the uneasiness when art becomes a subject of financial speculation. In thinking about these issues, it's useful to look at a historical precedent. This is the Dutch tulip mania of the 17th century. I didn't think of this parallel, it's in the literature. There's a marvelous book here by an English author, Anne Goldbar, Tulip Mania, that tells some of that story, which is told also in Simon Schama's great history of the Dutch Golden Age. Now, nowadays, tulips are banal enough, but in Holland at this point, they were exotic luxuries. They originally came from the Islamic world and were the subject of speculation. It's interesting, by the way, that you find them here on the tail of the Turkish airline. Like artworks, tulips served no practical function, and like artworks, they're graded by connoisseurs who gave high value to the most attractive, very rare specimens. Sometimes during tulip mania, very high value indeed. A single tulip was worth as much as a grand house, numerous animals and quantities of foodstuffs. It's a wonderful portrait here, 17th century portrait by a Dutch painter, Michael Jans van Mierenveld. A double portrait, a husband and a wife, and you can see they're holding the tulip in bulb, a double portrait with tulip. Nowadays, when people moralize and marvel about the cost of a few expensive artworks, as in that situation, many Dutch commentators responded worried about the high prices of tulips. You can see posh art, but tulips only blossom a few weeks of the year. As Goldgar explains, there are many complaints that tulip mania was turning values upside down, disrupting the social order. At this time, it's worth noting that upscale capitalist speculation was very important in Holland. Still, it seemed completely arbitrary that a few bulbs were so valuable. Speculation in tulips threatened moral chaos. So that's a historical parallel that is meant to get us to think about some of the issues about how we look at art galleries. Now, the second point I have is builds on the first, is brief. The function of the contemporary art gallery, I would argue, is to establish the exchange value of art. That's why it's important that art galleries are accessible public spaces. And of course, that's why they're the creations of modernist culture. Under the old regime, patronage was top-down. Nowadays, it's the product of public debate. At least that's the ideal. That's why these images here from the end of the old regime, 1760s, Paris, the Salon, and the Louvre are so important, because here we find the anticipation of all the concerns of the art gallery, namely the public evaluation of this massive works of art. And this, of course, is also why at this point we have the creation of that other modernist discipline, namely art criticism. The art critic gives a guide to the public. Quoting Thomas Crowe's important story of the salons, quote, "Prior to the 18th century, the popular experience of high art, however important and moving it may have been to the mass of people viewing it, was openly determined and administered from above." And here, of course, in the salon in the 1760s, we have something new. We have something moving towards the contemporary art gallery. So that, it seems to me, is a historical background. And I offer these two thoughts deliberately very sketchy and brief here so that we can begin.
Well, we hadn't rehearsed this, but it does kind of seem logical that I can go from David's last slide. I'm going to go through this pretty briefly. We may or may not be on the cusp of either the end of a system or the evolution of a system of galleries that started at the very least 100 years ago. One of the questions I'm often asked is, when is Acquavella going to have branches around the world, as if every gallery must have branches around the world. And also I'm asked this question by people who think that this is a new thing for galleries to have branches around the world. Also, the other thing I want to illustrate here is the kind of dynamic and relationship between galleries at different ends of a spectrum. And the portrait by Van Gogh is of a man named Père Tanguy, who was, in a sense, the Nest gallery of his era. He sold poor quality paints to artists who couldn't afford good quality paints, and he stuck their pictures in the window of his art supply store, Cézanne, Van Gogh, and others being part of his clientele. Now, Van Gogh actually worked at this other gallery, Goupil AC, which is here. Goupil AC was actually Van Gogh's uncle's, had shares in that gallery, and his brother Theo inherited those shares. Van Gogh actually borrowed books on drawing from that gallery. So there was established a kind of collegiality at that level. We tend to think of them being, in a sense, eons apart. Goupil made a lot of money selling what we would now consider to be Mannerist 19th century pictures. They had branches in Paris, London, Brussels, I have to read this, The Hague, Berlin, Vienna, New York, and Sydney. And this is all before 1900. So moving quickly forwards, and this gets slightly personal, because I'm saying that this kind of thing continued well into the middle of the 20th century. This is the space that I had on Spring and West Broadway, where I was paying a very, very modest rent, which allowed me to show artists whose work didn't sell at the time, including people like John Baldessari and Sean Scully. And at exactly the same time, more or less, the gallery where I now work, which is located on 79th Street Uptown, was showing Masters of Impressionism. So SoHo in the 60s, 70s, Nest galleries for artists. Those artists grew up. Some of the galleries closed, some of them flourished, some of them got bigger, and those artists went on, some of them, to what we call major galleries today. Is that going to go on? Is that system actually flourishing? I think not. I'm very, very anxious to hear what Wallace has to say, because his gallery is across the street from a gallery that I must say I was a customer of, bought young artists' work, called P! Gallery, which was funky, quirky, and managed, I don't know, a couple of years. Was it there for a couple of years, maybe?
Yeah, 3 years.
3 years, and then went out of business. A storefront gallery on Broome Street. Anecdotally, I would say I have heard in the last 6 months from colleagues of mine who have medium-sized galleries that there is a crisis of traffic, a crisis of sales. At the same time, of course, we see the big box galleries, the Kmarts, the supersized galleries, are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, or they're expanding. This may actually be a contraction, I'm not sure, but Pace building 5 floors onto their space downtown seems to me to be something of an expansion. One of the things that I question, though, is if these galleries go out of business, where are the artists going to be that in 10, 20, 30 years, or 10 minutes, will be represented by these galleries? Because these galleries, the big box galleries, don't start artists. They take artists that are fully cooked or half cooked or almost cooked and then move them up another level. But you need this I believe very, very firmly that you need this ecosystem. And one of the issues that I think we're going to discuss is, there's me running away from clients at Art Basel last year, is the art fairs now are the tail wagging the gallery's dog. When I came into the business, auction houses and art fairs were wholesalers. It's where dealers went to buy art, exchange information, look for each other's artists. At art fairs, for instance, the one that Rudolf Werner started in Cologne in the 60s and 70s. Auction houses were where dealers went to buy paintings that they would clean and frame and sell for a few bucks more or many bucks more well presented in their galleries. Auction houses, as we know, are super retailers. Art fairs are the one-stop shopping for everybody. So art fairs have become ubiquitous. Are they helping galleries survive, or are they putting us out of business? Not sure. This is the local problem. This is a problem that, as part of a group of art dealers, we sat down with some people from the mayor's office not so long ago. And although we were from many, many different types of galleries, our one concern was there is no housing for artists, let alone cheap rents for nest galleries anywhere in Manhattan. This is a real estate map of Manhattan. Red means you can't afford it, basically. No, I'm serious. If you saw this map even 10, 20 years ago or 40 years ago, there'd be plenty of yellow and brown and even maybe some green, which means you can afford it, your artist could afford it, a kid coming to New York with $1 and a dream and a paintbrush could afford it, but they can't anymore. Anyway, I've said enough. Thank you.
So rather than show you images, I just want to provide a little context for you. I feel like it's obvious why the two gentlemen on my left and my right are on this panel. And when you're asked to sit with such distinguished people, you think to yourself, why have they asked me to sit on this panel? What is it that they hope that I'll bring? And while these two gentlemen have the perspective of artist and gallerist and incredible gallerist and over here philosopher, I come from a very different perspective in the art world, and I think I'm meant to give you that other side. So I came of age in the museum world, sort of at the tail end of the last generation of the art world that these gentlemen were talking about before now, and I've witnessed the transition to the art world we're now in the middle of. We were talking about this just beforehand. We don't think the change has nearly just begun. I think while the art world's unrecognizable from 2 decades ago, it will be unrecognizable again in another decade. I think we all feel very strongly about that, whatever it may look like. But I just want to tell you a little bit about my background and my perspective that I'll bring to the conversation that I hope we're going to have here in a few minutes, that I think will be really interesting based on some of our pre-conversations. So I came of age in this art world of yore that was just on the precipice of change. Technology was just beginning to change the shape of things. Facebook was introduced in my second museum job, Instagram introduced in my third museum job. We went from a situation where you were mailing people to get them to come to all of a sudden communication became immediate and vast, and you could speak to 100,000 people immediately with a tweet. The world really, really shifted over the past 15 years, and as such, the art world adjusted as well. But for me personally, my perspective shifted based on the roles that I played in the art world. When I first began, I was working at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, which is an institution of about 80 full-time staff. And that was an incredible, incredible place to sort of grow up in the art world under the shepherding of Ann Goldstein and Paul Schimmel, who are incredible curators, and really working with the greatest of artists, from the minimalists to Bob Rauschenberg. I worked on the last show he did before he passed away, to shows of younger contemporary artists. I worked on Sterling Ruby's first museum show. And then I moved to the Getty, which is a very, very institutional institution of 1,500 people, multiple campuses, global relationships, an antiquities scandal, and many other interesting facets that I had to contend with. And in fact, one of those being the youngest person at the museum with an office trying to affect change in an institution that's similar to moving the Titanic. And then after that, I left and I moved to MoMA PS1, which is an institution of about 30 people, and was liaison to MoMA, an institution of about 800 people. And I had to get these two organizations to talk to each other right after the merger had first happened, after MoMA had acquired PS1. And the two were trying to figure out how to be mother and stepchild, and how to professionalize PS1 without losing its integrity. So out of that museum world and that museum education, I then shifted to a different side of the art world and began working for an agency called FITZ CO. And in my role, I am now a strategic advisor to arts organizations of all kinds. I still work with museums all over the world, from the Serralves Museum in Portugal to museums in Mexico, museums in the Middle East, that sort of thing. But my perspective really shifted when I started working with Art Basel, who is our oldest and one of our most important clients. The agency has worked with Art Basel for 20 years, been around for 21 years, and has seen it evolve from a single art fair to a global institution and a global brand. We now have shows in Hong Kong and Miami as well, which I'm sure you're quite familiar with. And we also work with galleries here, in Chelsea, and galleries all over the world, not to mention biennials. We work with the Sharjah Biennial, we work with 2139, the biennial in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. We do work all over the globe. And so what's happened to my perspective is that I went from this very narrow academic museum-like lens of the art world and how things were, where dealers are very, very bad, to an understanding of dealer as a necessary, not evil, but often hero in the right context. Artists need dealers, and the best of the dealers shape them and grow them and nurture them into incredible careers. And I find myself in the position of defending both galleries and art fairs all of the time, because it's very easy to vilify art dealers, gallery, auction houses, and art fairs. And yet my view of this art world ecosystem from the outside of it and from the deepest penetration within it is that each of these is absolutely necessary to the health and growth of the other. And so we cannot simply say auction houses are evil. We cannot simply say art fairs are just platforms for exchange. We cannot simply say dealers are just out to make money. If we do that, we miss the whole point, and we miss how beautifully they can work together in synchronicity when the ecosystem is healthy. The problem is we're at a moment right now where the ecosystem is in real jeopardy because it's being cinched in from the middle. It's sort of the same thing that's happening with the economy, right? The middle class is being pushed from both sides. The upper class is growing, the lower class is growing, and the middle class is disappearing. And that's what's happening in the gallery system. And that's why when they came to me with this panel, I turned down panels all the time because I travel constantly and it's really hard for me to commit to be in this city on a date. But the topic of this panel I found so interesting because I think the galleries have to survive in some form or another. They have to adapt and they have to change, but we need the galleries. And if we're not willing to sit down and talk about what's broken in this system and how we can fix it and how we can help the galleries, then we're all condemning ourselves because we are all part and parcel of this system that needs each other and that feeds on each other. And I look forward to having a vibrant conversation about how we see the future of the gallery system.
Let's see. All right, I'm going to give this a try here, see if this works. So my name's Wallace Whitney, and I'm a painter and an artist and a writer, and also started an art gallery 17 years ago with 3 other artists. And I'm just going to quickly run through I don't know, it's just so hard to figure out how to, I've never really talked about the gallery like this before ever, so I'm just spending a lot of time trying to figure out how do you talk about it. The art world and a gallery and what it means and what it does, and it's such a big question, and so I'm just gonna, I decided to start with the art and show 4 or 5 shows that I'm really proud of that, I don't even call myself a curator exactly, but had big hand in organizing and working on and things that I think are meaningful. And so I'm just going to read some notes that I wrote down when I was just sort of brainstorming in my studio last night. Like, what is a gallery? What is it? What is my gallery? What's the future of an art gallery? What is it? What's going to happen? So all these questions were floating around in my mind, and I just wrote down some quick notes. So right up here, first of all, is a show called Two Hanks, which is from 2003. And it's a show by David Askevold, who's now dead, but at the time he was alive. And that's David pouring champagne on a bag of dry ice. And it was a conjuring of Hank Williams and Hank Snow, a piece that he conceptualized in 1975, but was only realized in 2003. So this is a conjuring of these two country music stars. One was a famous teetotaler, Hank Snow, and the other one was a live hard, die young guy, Hank Williams. So this is Two Hanks. So I'll just click through some slides and read this. A gallery is a charismatic organization that has a point of view and shows artists that have a particular point of view. They need not to be homogenous. They need not to be a homogeneous group, but they have to work together somehow. Artists make art, communities and other artists make artists. Peers are the first and most finely tuned critics any artist will ever have. The best and most meaningful galleries are expressions of a group of artists. They can be competitive, warm, or other, but never boring. They can't be boring. A gallery lasts a generation at most. A gallery is a vessel, not a monument or an institution. A gallery should be forgotten, but the artists in the gallery that the galleries have built should be remembered if the project is a success. Galleries don't sign contracts with their artists and vice versa. The relationships, which over time can generate a lot of money, are based on friendship, mutual aid, and conversation about studio practices. This is a show that I curated with an artist named Brendan Cass called New York's Finest, and this is 2005. And it was a kind of a swashbuckling roundup of painting that was happening at that moment in New York City. So in the middle, there's a painting by Joe Bradley, and this is, I think, probably the first time he showed his work in New York. Next to his painting is one of my paintings. To the left, Josh Smith, Brian Ballot, Jennifer Monick, and Brendan Cass himself with the New York City skyline. Another shot of the same exhibition with Catherine Bernhardt, the figure, another Josh Smith painting, Catherine Bradford painting, Bill Saylor painting, the Jetstream Loser. Canada was founded in 2001 by 4 artists in a basement on Broadway in Lower Manhattan. We moved to Chinatown shortly after 9/11 because our space was very close to 9/11 and we lost it in that event. The gallery began as a discussion which was about a dearth of places to show our work and a way to support each other's practices. So I'm talking about myself, the sculptor Sarah Brayman, Phil Grauer, and Aaron Brewer. Aaron is not with the gallery anymore, but the 3 of us still run the gallery to get today. So some of the issues that we were thinking about were abstraction, color, scale, large scale, which seemed to be really left out of the discussion at that point in New York. Because New York art, as Rebecca was saying, the art world was really different then, and we can maybe talk about that. It was really nice to hear Michael talk a little bit about some of his experiences, and I love that idea of archaeology and the way things change over time. So it's basically a discussion around post-conceptual painterly abstraction. This is a show called Material Issue, which was probably from 2009. There's a Lauren Luloff painting on a stilt, a Jess Fuller painting, and a Josh Blackwell sculpture on the wall with the embroidered bags. And this takes us up to the new space. We got new digs about 6 or 7 years ago. We moved north in Chinatown about 4 blocks. This is a show called The Hawk from a Handsaw by the sculptor Joanna Malinowska. In the future, galleries will be everywhere, not just in art centers like New York or LA. Artists will feel free to move around following cheap rent and possibilities to have shows. Artists will feel freer to curate shows, write about art, open spaces and bars, while maintaining the moniker artist. The art will become more web-like, held together by an informed audience. The quality of writing about art will increase, as will the volume, and there will be a backlash against seeing art on the internet. It'll become fashionable again to travel to see art.
It sounds like the good old days.
Like the good old days, he said.
Oh, and this is those last 2 shows were this was a show called Support Surface from 2014, 15. French painters from the 70s. There's a big Claude Viola, for example, and a Dana DeZeus. And this is the show that's up right now. It's Matt Connor's called Hawk It, and it's a series of abstract paintings.
Okay.
And this is the opening to show that people still come out and want to talk to each other and talk nonsense and drink beer together. So,
Thank you. You know, I think since we're going to be talking here, can we get the lights up in the room? It's easier, maybe for us, we see each other, we can. Oh, thanks. Thanks, Mayor. So many questions here. I made a list. I'm an academic. Let's focus on one of those. What can we say about galleries versus art fairs? I mean, you can moralize, you can compare. Who wants to tackle this kind of question of, is the art fair replacing the gallery? Might it? Is that a good thing, a bad thing? How does anyone want to play that kind of issue?
Well, I can maybe speak from the art fair perspective on that one and say that the art fair does not in any way hope to replace the gallery at all, and instead is intending to give the galleries a viable means of competing with auction houses and other galleries who are global. The art fairs are meant to present an opportunity for smaller galleries to have a global presence without having to have bricks and mortar spaces everywhere. So how can you, as a smaller gallery, compete with a Hauser and Wirth if you're not in the 8 cities they have a space? If you do art fairs in as many locations, in theory, that gives you the same opportunity or global footprint to meet people. So at least from Art Basel's perspective, the gallery is actually the most important client. They're not intending to usurp them, but rather to support them and bolster them. That's not to say that art fairs don't add constraints and challenges for galleries, and certainly the more art fairs that you try to do, economically speaking, the more challenging that can be, and I think there's definitely a point of diminishing returns. You used the statement upstairs, you know, I just did one too many art fairs last year, and I think a lot of galleries are having to find that tipping point and settle back in to how many galleries is the right number, or how many art fairs is the right number of art fairs, but I don't think we should see art fairs as replacing galleries in any way.
Well, I hope not. I think that it's a very complex issue because some dealers are primary market dealers, and they have a lot of manufacturers, and they have to find outlets for all their artists' work. And the ideal outlet used to be, in a sense, a solo exhibition. Now, you can't squeeze a solo exhibition into an art fair. Other galleries, other dealers are secondary market dealers, and the gallery that I work at is almost entirely secondary market. We have 2 or 3 artists we wouldn't attempt to introduce an artist at an art fair. We take inventory to an art fair because we hope there are going to be people there, and some of them we already know are expecting to see it. So the art fair is perhaps the end of the retail process rather than the beginning of introduction. My biggest problem, and I think this has to do with just the speed that we live now and the monetization of the art market. Well, first of all, I use the word art market. I came into an art world, and I think you used the word art world. When did the art world become almost exclusively the art market? At the same time as an art dealer became referred to as a gallerist, and that was 2004 in a New Yorker magazine, but we won't go into that. The speed at which people can review everything that's possibly for sale at an art fair is extraordinary. And everybody complains about there's too much to see and they're tired, but they go there, they spend 2 days, they see everything, they buy a few things, right? And we go there we go trundling around the world to Hong Kong or Basel or London, and we do fine. We sell enough, but I guess my question is, where is the collector now who I run into on the corner of Madison and 77th Street at 3 in the afternoon, who says, "What have you got for me? Do you have anything for me? What have you got?" Who drags me back to where I work and wants me to pull stuff out for them to see. And they're prepared to spend an hour looking at it. Because that's how I used to do my business. I still do, in a way, do it that way. And that's the way that people built great collections, by actually ending up buying things they had no intention when they woke up that morning of even thinking about. Now, instead, I get a text message which is asking me if I have a red Grotjon that is 60 inches square for $10 million. And if I say yes, they don't say, "I'm going to come and see it." They say, "Please send me a condition report," right? So this is a very, very different way of doing business. I still think that people have to look at paintings before they buy them. And I'm not sure if the few minutes that they're given at an auction preview or even at an art fair are enough. Although I have to say, as a seller, the sense of opportunity, the perhaps rather artificial sense of you better buy it now because someone else will, right, that is generated at an art fair does propel people to buy.
This is fascinating. I love these differences. Speaking as an art critic, what is so wonderful about the galleries in New York is how finely tuned they are. And I became, when I was working on this last book, a kind of aesthete about galleries. I would think they're better and better, which is best, and they're so fabulous. Whereas by comparison, the thing about an art fair, as you say, it's exhausting because you walk in and there are a lot of things to see, and there seems to be no particular order. I mean, a pecking order of galleries, I suppose. And it is kind of put there, and even the grand things in the art fair are shown on the kind of temporary wall. Now, maybe that shows the condition of contemporary art in the society, that, you know, lots of our things do hang on temporary walls. But I guess what I'm suggesting is that aesthetically, a gallery seems so much preferable to an art fair, but I understand that to offer that aesthetic point is not going to satisfy the practical conditions. The last panel here, I had a friend, Becca Clayman, who works at Michael Werner, and Werner does, she told me, 12 art fairs a year. Now, if you think of, I mean, you know, as someone, I think of the wear of terror, getting all these objects and the employees and whatever to move to Hong Kong, to Basel, and so forth. This is a big task, and presumably you have to be a formidable gallery in order to even enter into that kind of fair system.
Yeah, it's a big job, no doubt about that. I mean, I don't know, going to an art fair to have an experience with art is, I don't know, like going to the aquarium to experience a beach or something. You know, it's just not, it's not what it's for. You know, it's like, it's not for art lovers, it's for dealers and collectors. Those are the two, and perhaps critics to some degree. But it's set up so you will sell. And it's a harsh thing to do to art. And, you know, it's so rare to see something and be knocked over. And, you know, so like, do I like this because it's good or just because I'm at an art fair and all my antenna are completely haywire because I'm in an aircraft carrier with terrible light and overpriced coffee and my feet hurt and here's a Morandi painting or something. You know, and I can't even tell if it's good or not. It's just this overheated event. But that said, it's a cool spectacle. And we make most of our money there, and so we do that, and it's useful to rank yourself against other galleries. It's the one yardstick maybe in the art world where you're constantly trying to get up to the higher and higher and higher point. And honestly, it's really hard to do that because the people at the top aren't really willing to share because there's a pretty small audience to buy art, and they're, you know, why would they want to be generous with that limited pool of money? So cracking through has been this 15-year project that we kind of stumbled into, which doesn't have very much to do with art or any of the stuff I talked about, but it was just this idea of like wanting to storm this kind of citadel, and there is definitely kind of like a system that's stacked against you if you aren't, you know, born into that world or somehow have some sort of entree into it, as in working at a gallery beforehand, so you know the kind of secret handshake. It's a garden party, and it's really difficult to crack through, but it's worth it because the galleries that do are the ones that have ultimately the longest. Have longevity. So, I mean, that's what all I want to say about art fairs.
I have a question I'd like to talk to Rebecca about, maybe, which I think Wallace just brought up. And it has to do with the control that the organizers of major art fairs have over who gets in and who doesn't get in. And what they have to do to get in and who they have to be to get in. And I think it varies a lot from art fair to art fair. But what struck me recently, I was participating at Frieze Masters in London, and well, I won't mention any names. I ran into colleagues of mine who have I think a very, very good gallery. It's not a huge gallery, but it's been around for about 10 years, and I think they have a very good program. They've done unusual exhibitions, some historical exhibitions, and they were told by a person in control of another art fair that they might be considered if they increased the educational nature of their programming. And I didn't feel, I mean, I know the gallery very well. They had, in fact, a very educational programming, but this is a gallery that was being told I don't know, I'm going to be very crude. It sounded to me, you know, like a guy who owns a strip club telling a ballet dancer they better take some lessons before they can, you know, they can come in. Because I don't know why a gallery should have to prove that they have an educational program in order to take their merchandise to a mart. You know, I think, yes, you have to be able to pay the rent on that space. So it's the art fair as, in a sense, tastemaker and powerhouse, because it is. There are galleries who I know who have been kicked out of art fairs, who basically will then lose their, you know, galleries that have been in business for 20, 30 years. They're told, well, you're too boring, or you're not bringing enough good stuff, or it's not the stuff that we like, and they're going to go out of business. So there's a huge power there, and I wonder if you know, if you think that's going to be, if that's appropriate, if it's going to increase, if there's some way of adjusting that.
I mean, I certainly agree. There's definitely a lot of power situated, particularly in the highest echelon of the art fair business. But I think what often doesn't get talked about is how the best art fair directors, if they're doing their jobs right, spend a lot of their time out looking for younger galleries and trying to bring them into the fold. I can't speak for other art fairs. I don't know what they do, but I know that Art Basel, whenever any of those directors are in any city, not only do they visit the galleries who show at Art Basel, they go and try and see the youngest galleries there, and whether they're going to hopefully show at Art Basel in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. One, it's to stay in touch. Two, it's to help nurture that system and understand that every local scene needs galleries at every level. But most importantly, it's to look for young, local, great talent and to start to bring them into the fair so that it doesn't just become an old boys club, so that it isn't the same 80 galleries you see every year. That's why fairs now have sectors like, you know, Nova in Miami Beach, which is for young fairs, sectors that are more about historical positions, and galleries can come in with a one-time proposal rather than based on their overall program. And it's meant to diversify the opportunity and I think in some ways distribute that power a little bit more evenly, because otherwise you're absolutely right, it can become quite concentrated. But for instance, I don't know if you've ever heard of Gypsum Gallery, but all of a sudden they showed at Art Basel for the first time this year in Basel. And now, when you go to Cairo, it's the first thing I think of. I'm always looking, whenever I go to a new city, I use the fair actually as a guide of where to start in terms of what galleries to see. And not just the Hauser and Wirths and the Zorners and the Gagosians, but also Rodeo Gallery. I want to go see their program because I happened upon their booth, and while I'll agree with you absolutely, the aesthetic presentations in an art fair booth are nothing compared to seeing the actual gallery. It's meant to entice you, to give you a taste of their program such that when you're in their home city, that's the first thing that you want to do is come in and spend an hour in your back room saying, what can you show me? And that's the experience I have. You know, when I go to Athens, I want to see Kalfayan Gallery, not because I ever would have known what that was before Art Basel, but now, after several Art Basels, I know their program really well, and I can't wait to see everything else that they have to show me in the back room. So for me, the fair has actually blossomed my understanding of galleries and made it much larger than the gallery system I see and read about in the New York Times, because I now know about galleries in every corner of the world, and if I go to Buenos Aires, I know which galleries to go see in a way that I wouldn't if I didn't go to art fairs.
I wonder if that's true.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just who picks these people that have, you know, basically controlled the purse strings. I mean, it's sort of like comes up, you know, over this. I mean, I don't even know if it's a system exactly. It's sort of like I just wish there was a way that artists could be have more agency, and there's a feedback loop that no other institution in the art world that I could think of that provides so heavily as an art fair. It's like you see things in an art fair, it has this leveling effect. It's sort of like one dealer sees another dealer, and then there's this sort of dialogue between dealers, and so there's a way that is kind of, there's a type of consensus that's built at an art fair, and I feel like it's kind of unhealthy for art, and that's why I made a point of saying that art fairs are for dealers and for buyers. I mean, it's not a place of culture, and that's what's troubling, is that you have to do an art fair now, or else you're going to go belly up unless you're willing to have 5 people a year see your show.
Well, without exactly disagreeing with that, but adding to that, or maybe it is, and picking up on Rebecca's point, there's something that the 4 of us talked about in Graham's office before we came out here, and that's the international nature of the art world, which has changed so dramatically. I mean, when you read of the previous generation, Leo Castelli's life, okay, he had a connection in St. Louis, a connection in Toronto, and then a connection in Paris, whereas now you look at all these new art markets that have opened up, China, the Islamic world and such. And I wonder, can we say something about how that kind of internationalization plays in, maybe helpfully or not, to see that what we're talking about the art fairs and the institutions, and how does someone become recognized? I mean, how does a Chinese artist become recognized, or how someone from Beirut, or someone from South Africa, or lots of cases we could talk about here.
Absolutely. I mean, I think Joanna Hadjitamis and Khalil Jarij just won the Marcel Duchamp Prize last week while I was in Beirut. And the local celebration to have Lebanese artists winning this hugely important prize, and they came to recognition through these systems and through these channels in a way that they might not have been able to without the global nature of the art world now, through exhibitions in Sharjah, through this global network that has now been built. And yes, there are certainly issues with this system, but I think in some ways there are more opportunities now than there have ever been. There's also more limitations, more structures, more biases, more powers. I'm not saying it's better than it used to be, but I think there are opportunities. One of my very dear friends owns a gallery in Beirut. And when we met 2 years ago, when I walked into her gallery with the director of Art Basel, we wandered in and we were in town for the opening of the Aishti Foundation. Now, would we know about that gallery otherwise if we weren't, in this global world, out there going to things, looking, hunting things down, trying to find people? Now she's showing at Lista. She's like earning her stripes in the art world. And it's a terrific gallery, and her artists now have the opportunity to be shown potentially on a global scale because of the people who are walking in that never would have walked in 10 years ago. And I think that's the positive side of what you're talking about, this globalization. I mean, it's more frenzied, it's more crazy. I have to be in how many countries in a month? My team's sitting back there, I mean, they hardly see me because I have to be everywhere else where all of our clients are. But that's the good and the bad of this global world we now live in. And I think it does, when harnessed properly, breed a lot of opportunity at every level. It's more challenging, it's more expensive, it's more difficult. You wish you could clone yourself. You wish you were immune to jet lag, all of those things. But it's an exciting and pretty incredible world, and I feel like I have the opportunity to know about, as an art lover, to see art more across the world than generations before me who might have just known the generation that grew up in their 30-block radius.
I have a word or two. I don't disagree with Rebecca. However, I think that what she is living in and what she describes accurately is a fast-paced, hard-charging, very high-rent world. Countries that can now host art fairs tend to be countries with booming economies. I think that's certainly wouldn't you say there's a pretty strong overlap between, the wealth that is the wealth that exists in a particular community, whether it's Saadiyat Island or not, and their ability to create and sustain an art fair where somebody like Acquavella is going to want to go because there are enough wealthy people there that it makes it worth our while. However, artists used to travel a lot, even in the days of Leo Castelli. The globalization of the art world now is enhanced certainly by the internet. It's not enhanced by the cost of airfares. I would maintain that actually in the 60s, New York was much more cosmopolitan because you had many European artists who would come here and they lived here for 2 or 3 years, whether it was Marcel Race or or Alan Jones or Richard Hamilton, British artists, French artists, German artists, and they would in fact engage in the world that Wallace has described as the world of the future, where they're part of a community staying at the Chelsea Hotel, in and out of Max's Kansas City, in and out of each other's studios, in and out of galleries, and the galleries were showing a lot of galleries that in those days had a very New York galleries had international artists, and believe it or not, the Whitney Biennial, which was an annual where you actually bought pictures, did not discriminate against artists who were not Americans. In fact, if you lived in New York and had a studio in New York, you were eligible for the Whitney Annual, and they sold work. So I think that I may be being very nostalgic for what I think of as a simpler, gentler world. It's not a world that exists anymore. It's not a world I live in. I kind of probably live more in Rebecca's world. I have to. I think though that there has got to be room in the future. I think museums have a lot of the responsibility for being able, if they're willing, to slow people down and encourage people to really look at art and become critical about it, because the people who are the collectors that Wallace talks about, being the dealers and collectors at art fairs, they have got to start somewhere, and they've got to start by learning how to look at pictures rather than just listening to what their neighbor has been buying.
I just want to follow up and say that it's interesting to talk about travel and art and what the relationship is. I think that art gains value culturally through traveling. I think if it stays in the studio and doesn't have an audience, it diminishes its value. And I think that's the only real reason for an artist to take their work somewhere else, and for someone who is in the position like myself, who's lucky enough to maybe show art, to go to another city to see what's going on here. What are people talking about? Sometimes you strike out, sometimes you don't, but it's a word of mouth type of situation, and I operate on a sort of a slightly different plane than the art world plane, and I'm interested, to bring it back to this idea of artist generated culture and trying to make discoveries based on that, because my view of the art market and maybe you got to pay the rent, and that's fun, but the viewpoint that you get at an art fair is skewed, I think, and I guess I've made that point 7 times, but
I think this is fascinating because the more we talk here, it seems to me we find all sorts of interesting uncertainties, and that's, you can look at the present, is the glass half full, half, all kinds of uncertainties which are exciting or terrifying. I think of a simple example of international, which is China, because I taught there for a semester. And you say, here's a country with a lot of energy, with a grand history, with a lot of ambitious students, but what kind of art world is going to evolve? There's a kind of market system that can look like American ones in some of the same galleries. China is not going to have museums like Western ones. Think of this country. A century ago, the newly rich Americans were assembling the European masterpieces and such, and then working through modernism. But that picture, for better or worse, is closed. That's not going to happen in China. So whatever is going to happen in China, it's going to be some very, very different story that with all those museums there, it's very hard to envisage what it's going to look like and how is it going to look, you see, when it goes to the West. I think those questions are, again, they can seem exciting, they can seem terrifying, but certainly very hard to tell what could happen with this system. I find that interesting.
I think that you touched on something that interests me a lot, which is that in China there has been developed an instantaneous ecosystem. We could talk about ecosystem in New York going from nest galleries to, over a period of 50 years involving real estate. the K11 developments in Hong Kong and Shanghai and other cities are huge urban developments which include shopping malls, residential, commercial, and embedded in them are art galleries, art museums, and art villages where the artists work. So this is kind of like an instant ecosystem. The art aspect giving premium value to the real estate development. I think that is. I think that's the future there. I would also say that, having also been to Beijing and taught there, but much more briefly, I did ask somebody there who was in a position to know. I said, what is the relationship between the central government and everything that is happening in terms of, the art market, museums, etc.? And he paused and he said, well, what was the relationship in the Renaissance between art and the Holy Roman Catholic Church? He said, it's the same.
That's good. Other questions we could talk about I posed? Anyone want to say anything about, we talked about this again before we got here.
Somebody in the audience.
Oh, sorry, let's get your question, sure.
Please wait for the mic.
Okay. Bringing it back to New York City, there are galleries in Chelsea that are known as vanity galleries, and there are pop-ups that have been happening in the city. What do you guys think about that?
Not much.
A vanity gallery? Doesn't sound good to
I
me.
think they've always been vanity galleries in New York. Some of them better disguised than others, I think.
Yeah, I don't think those last very long and don't have much. The whole goal is to move the cultural needle, and just the premise of a vanity gallery. I don't know why someone would do that to make themselves feel good about themselves. I guess I don't know.
Is there a question? We have to get the mic to you.
Yeah, I think
So
you're
you
not
can
much
get on
was the perfect answer.
Sorry. Sorry, I don't mean to be rude.
No, I don't.
Firstly,
think
thank you to
about
everyone. It's been really interesting to hear everyone's viewpoint. And I think I know what I'm going to ask here. Earlier on, you talked about, I think it was you, Rebecca, brought up the fact that you have to try and protect these young galleries. And also, David, you talked about the P explanation gallery that disappeared.
Oh yeah.
After
Michael said that.
Yeah, sorry, Michael. Sorry,
Yeah.
Michael said that. My question is how do you protect galleries like that, and how do they survive, and what does that mean for the younger artists coming up now, and also that big brother thing where there are these people making decisions on who does or doesn't get in? And one other thing that I think, Rebecca, you mentioned was the ability for galleries to really shape someone's future as an artist. Like, all these things feel so important, and as an artist myself, these are all things that concern me. How do you get in? How do you actually work up the ranks? And what does this new system mean for someone coming up through the ranks?
Well, he's doing it successfully. And I think that's extraordinary, because I think it's very, very difficult to do. When I was in SoHo back in the day, we used to shop at AIR. There was AIR galleries. There were a number of cooperative galleries. They showed good works. AIR was all women artists, and the community supported them. The works were not that expensive, and you went in there and you bought something, and it was. I don't know. There was a collegial spirit. You shared. There were five collectors. They came down. They went in and out of every gallery. Now it is dog eat dog. It's a cutthroat business. But I don't know how he does it.
I don't either. I mean, the key word here is like poaching, I guess. So Canada has a reputation as like finding artists and before they've shown and incubating them and giving them their first shows, and then they end up at an auction or something and their prices go through the roof, or something, or the press latches onto it, and then the next thing you know, all these bigger galleries are sneaking around your door, waving big bucks at these kids, and it could make you jaded, I guess, and I think that's the hardest thing, and that's why in the beginning I mentioned this idea that there's no contracts, like it's all relationships, and it's like, okay, we can offer you this, this, and this. These guys can offer you this, this, and that. What are you going to do? Are you going to stay with your friends, or are you going to go off and cream out up in Chelsea or something like that? And it's a really hard decision for everybody involved, and that's life, and we've had it happen both ways. I mean, we've never had to poach an artist from another gallery, and I think that just crosses the line for me, because I know that a small gallery in Williamsburg, there's probably amazing artists, and we could suck them into our thing because we're bigger, and maybe we can offer them more visibility or something like that. But that doesn't. I don't know if that's really why we started in the first place. And it's some ways I don't know. It's just I can't even really figure it out for myself. But in terms of like what you are and where your position is, you have to do it yourself. I mean, there's no one who's going to come along and help you. Is basically what I'm trying to say.
Maybe if I can articulate part of the sense of crisis one can feel, it's that any kind of art world like ours depends upon the idea that new people come along, that there are young artists who are really interesting, because otherwise it would just be historical. It would just be looking back. And yet if you look at the whole history of art, you know that, in Rome after the High Renaissance, there was a kind of a lull. In France, at a certain point, there was a lull. And so the whole question, I think, about the future is a question, is it going to keep going? Are there young artists who are going to appear that are as interesting as the senior ones in the culture? But also, to play on your point, it's a question of, is there going to be a support system for these young artists? Is there going to be someone who say, well, she's 25 and interesting, and let's nurture her? That's hard to tell, I guess.
I don't know. Yeah, I love artists and I love galleries, and when a gallery closes, it's a tragedy, even if I can't stand their program, because here are these artists who have been orphaned and they don't have the network anymore, and a little bit of culture dies. And that's why it's worth doing. That's why it's worth going to art fairs and putting up with the badges and all that stuff that I was, talking about, because it's a platform and they're rare. A museum isn't going to do the job. We don't have government funding for artists in this country, and so you kind of have to face facts sometimes. And like, what's our environment like? And yeah.
I don't know, it just seems to me there are these two issues that have been brought up that seem relevant to future of an art gallery. Number one is artists selling their own work online, either directly or through places like Saatchi. And secondly, art fairs that are not for art galleries, but are for artists. Saatchi happens to be one that's organized, one that's coming up now, but there's dozens of these things where artists have to pay a certain amount, but participate in an art fair. So these seem to me to be both challenges to the traditional notion of the art gallery.
All that operates completely outside of my world, so I don't pay attention to any artist,
I think that
anything that's charging artists.
regardless of how the delivery systems are going to change, I think the artist needs a intermediary, a producer, a publisher, a dealer, somebody who is between them and the public. To protect them, to allow them to stay in the studio and to work so that they don't actually have to do it themselves. I think that's really, really important. I'm on the board of the New York Foundation for the Arts, and one of the things that that they do is they provide boot camps for artists, young artists, emerging artists, older artists, immigrant artists, basically, which are skills not necessarily in marketing themselves, but just in managing their lives once they're beginning to maybe sell one or two pictures. But I think that whether that person is going to be called an art dealer or with some other word, I think there has got to be an intermediary. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would avoid anything that you have to pay to do as an artist.
Absolutely.
It doesn't seem right. They should sell your work and keep 50% like any other gallery does. Like you get half, and the other guy gets half, and that's a lot. And yeah, and I think you do need an intermediary. I think that selling work and being an artist are two really different things. And as I get older and have a more developed practice and run the gallery longer, I really understand that those are two very different skills. But yeah, so I think that that's important.
And I think from my point of view as a critic, the great thing about the gallery system is that it is a selection system. I mean, you can very quickly walk along and you can look at a lot of different works. Maybe some interest you, some don't. But I mean, at least you have a sense that the works, the mere fact that they're there, they've already passed through a certain eye, that people have reflected and thought and said, she's interesting, he's interesting, they're interesting, let's go. And so that, from that point of view, from my, if you will, selfish point of view, the gallery system is
I think you could
essential.
probably sell a few things online, but I'm talking about having a long practice, and the long practices are the meaningful practices, and by long I mean 20 plus years, and I think you need somebody to either, you know, it doesn't have to be a dealer, it just needs to be somebody who can help you vocalize what you're doing. And yeah, there's this old saying, like in an art fair, someone like, oh, denigrating some buyer, because collectors are competitive with one another too, and they say, oh, that person, they're not really a very good collector. They buy with their ears, not their eyes. I don't know if you've ever heard that. And my response is like, they should definitely buy with their ears. You shouldn't be looking at things. You should, you know, if you're going to buy art, you're going to buy something that someone told you to buy because, you know, they're the ones that know. I mean, artists know, dealers know, because they spend more time doing it. And I think artists know more about art than anybody. And talking about art and the conversations that come out of communities, that's, you know, you can't buy that. And the collector class, if they're smart, they understand that. They know to listen to artists first, people who have some sort of insight, you know, because they've had a practice and have the experience. I mean, that's, I don't know, it's, you know.
You've mentioned the role of technology in the way...
I'm sorry, I can't quite hear.
You've mentioned the role of technology in the way that the art world and the art market functions today, and I was wondering if you could talk about certain like online platforms like FITZ CO or Part of A, and what positive or negative things they might bring on the table.
That's for you.
Is that for me?
I say it's for you.
Yeah.
Online platforms are probably one of the greatest unknowns of the art world and what will last and what won't. They were all sort of introduced in various stages, all doing something similar and each having various benefits. And I think the positive benefits are increased awareness, opportunity. There's a level of transparency there that I think most of the art world isn't comfortable with. That is probably good for us to have a little bit more of. But I think whether or not these can prove to sustain themselves at the upper echelon of the art world or will stay where they currently are right now remains to be seen. Certainly the buying from a JPEG reticence that was once there is not there anymore. That happens quite a bit more, although I definitely agree with Michael. You should see something before you buy it.
Yeah, but if you're never going to look at it and just put it in a warehouse, but then sell it to someone else on a JPEG, you really don't ever have to see it.
I will say that I have had collector friends of mine who are very true connoisseur collectors who weren't at a fair, who heard that there was something there that they wanted, say, will you just go look at this for me and let me know? It looks great from the JPEG, the condition report's perfect, I think it's exactly what I want, but I just want someone I trust to look at it up close. And then they'll buy it if you say, you know, yes, I looked, it's beautiful, I would buy it. But there's still, I think, that desire from most true collectors, especially above a certain price point, to see an actual object, to experience it. And so I don't know if the artsies are going to be able to break that threshold. But maybe they don't have to. Maybe they can operate in their own place and add value. I mean, I think there's Ocula as a platform I find particularly interesting in that they allow more exposure for the Asia-Pacific region. So actually, for me, it's more of a platform discovery than, say, Artsy. Artsy is also a little bit less discriminating about who is on there and what it can be, and you might find those vanity galleries she was talking about over there aligned right next to someone else who I think is a quality gallery. And so whether or not the art world ultimately pushes those to the periphery and they become vanity channels or embraces them but at the lowest price point of the business, I think really remains to be seen. But digital transactions are not going anywhere, whether they're transparent and on a website where you can go look and see how much something costs, or they're behind the scenes. The digital nature of the art world and that fast-paced aspect of the business, that's here to stay and probably only escalating.
Looking at the clock, we feel here we should have one more question. We're looking for a question that will open up all of the themes and allow us to reach a marvelous closure, and which we will have true agreement.
Well, oh dear. Well, okay, I'll bring up an aspect. You've been speaking about it, though, to some extent all along, about the nature of a culture and the nature of artistic creativity. Having gone around the world and seen many things, do you think there's something that happens in the nature of creativity, the thought of art market, or in any way the nature of painting and the development of painting because of this vast change in culture? And so I'm sort of curious about how this will affect the interior life of an artist in relationship to the new cultural world we live in.
I think our artist will have to be the one to...
I'll pass on that. Good question. But
Go ahead.
I mean, I would just say that I'm not an artist, so I don't properly feel equipped to answer your question, but if I spend time with an artist who's just spent time in an area for the first time, for instance, I remember at Adrian Villarreal's opening in Calba, which is the east coast of Sharjah. Most of you probably are very, very well educated and couldn't find that on the map. But Adrian had spent 3 months there living with his studio people, his studio assistants, building this incredible installation in an abandoned ice factory. And Adrian was a different man than I had seen 3 months before when we'd been together in Kassel, because that experience had changed him. It had evolved him as a person, it had evolved his practice. The work was different than the work he had made in Kassel just 3 months before. Obviously, coming out of the same threads, the same person that Adrian is as an artist, but he made a work that was site-specific, not only to the location he was building in, but his experience living in there in a dry region. When his practice is built around, you know, having a beer with the guys at the end of a hard day, and he was talking to me about how that even changed his practice, how they had to find new realms for their camaraderie, and how it brought him and the guys even closer being there in this place and in this location. Now, this is probably a more extreme example, but I feel like I would imagine all artist residencies in any place that's very foreign to you or different from where you grew up would absolutely impact your creativity. And in the same way that I mentioned to the gentleman upstairs, I was in Park Sebo's studio in Seoul not that long ago, and I saw a poster signed by Bob Rauschenberg. And I said to him, when did you meet Bob? And he was telling me about how when Bob had come through Asia, he had met him, and he said to us, It was a pivotal moment in his practice, and it radically changed his work. Now, if any of you know Park Se-Bo's work and Bob Rauschenberg's work, you might think, what? Because that was what I thought at that moment. And I queried him a little further and said, what was the impact? And he said, Bob taught me that whatever I decided to make was art. He gave me artistic license. He changed how I viewed my own practice. And so I think any exposure to another place, to another people, to another culture is, of course, it's going to impact an artist. It changes me every time I go to a new country. Every time I go to Beirut, I come out a different person. You know, this last time I got the amazing opportunity to go see Armand's Peace Tower, which is on military property, and most people never get to see it. That experience changed my understanding of the Lebanese Civil War, and then my understanding of Joanna and Khalil's work, and of Walid Raad's work, and of all of these artists who are making work in response to this. So I think every time we have a new experience, it changes us, it enhances us, and it pushes us into new places. And that, I think, is what's exciting about globalization.
Can I say one? Yeah. That's very true. Very, very true. Taking a very long historical perspective, I wonder if we always think that the age we're in is the golden age. We are certainly in a golden age economically, if we look at the billionaire class, which is responsible for the headlines that we read, and that drives a lot of our attention in terms of the art market. I think creativity essentially is about risk-taking. And I think, for instance, Bob Rauschenberg is a very good example of somebody who took huge risks when he was completely unknown and continued to take huge risks throughout his life as an artist. I also tend to think that we are living in a culturally risk-aversive society right now. And I think that the higher the economic stakes are for the artist, the less risk perhaps they take. So I would give a toast to Wallace and his artists, and for allowing them and giving them permission to take risks and not to care about the economic consequences.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Good place to end.
That's